Okay, so the the topic of my talk today is based on a paper I've been working on for quite some time. Um, I should say up front, the paper is quite long, so I'm probably going to have to breeze through some things that are quite controversial. So if you think some of the things I'm saying are going a little bit too quickly, that's probably because they are. Um, so feel free to ask about those things in the Q&A, or just reach out to me afterwards with an email or something like that. I'll flag certain contentious bits here and there. So I've got some assumptions I just bracket in the paper, and I'll do the same here. I'll flag those, and I think they're worth talking about in the Q&A. The second thing worth mentioning is that the paper topic itself is quite narrow. That's just necessary given the fact that it's an academic paper. You're not going to be able to write a paper addressing everything. Um, so I thought before I get into the narrow topic of my paper, which, as you can tell from the title here, it's on something called epistocracy. For now, I'll just gloss that as a form of government where the possession of a certain level of political knowledge is a legal prerequisite for possessing political power of some kind, right? The subtitle there mentions institutional design. So I thought it's worth first introducing what I mean by institutional design, give some examples, and talk a little bit about why I think it's important and why effective altruists might or probably should study this a bit more, take it a bit more seriously. And then I'll get into the main topic of today, which is squarely on epistocracy, some things I think it gets right and some things I think it does wrong. And then in the conclusion, I will have some concluding remarks, funnily enough. That's how conclusions usually go. All right. So first, what do I mean by institutions? It's one of those things where depending on who you ask, you're going to get a million different definitions. I'm not going to bother trying to provide some sort of like exceptionalist definition in terms of necessary and sufficient conditions. Instead, I'll point to this quotation from Elinor Ostrom. So this is a good. This sort of encapsulates what I think about when I think about political institutions. I actually can't see the full quotation because some of the things from Zoom are obscuring it. But I mean, it doesn't really matter. Hopefully, you can see it. Basically, the idea is that institutions are the sort of working rules we use to determine who is eligible to make decisions in political domains, what sort of actions are allowed. So think about things like constitutional constraints, what sort of aggregation rules will be used. So I'll talk about some examples of that, and so on and so forth. So here are some concrete examples. Sorry, give me 1 second. So today we're going to think about formal political institutions. By formal, I just mean things that are legal. So we're not interested in things like informal norms, although they are interesting. So here are some examples of formal political institutions. So think about a choice between different voting methods. So you can have simple plurality voting where each person gets one vote. You can vote for at most one candidate, and the candidate with a plurality of votes wins. You can have approval voting where there's a list of candidates and you can either approve them or not, and the most approved candidate ends up winning. Something like a single transferable vote, that's what we have in Ireland. It's a form of ranked choice voting. You can have even broader questions about the legal distribution of fundamental political power. So something that's going to come up today are questions related to whether to have universal suffrage as opposed to restricted suffrage. Now, I should just comment here that in practice, this is a question between like minimally restricted suffrage and a bit more restricted suffrage. Proponents of epistocracy, quite rightly in my view, will point out that all democracies are minimally epistocratic to the extent that they exclude children from access to voting rights, for example, and typically on the grounds of their alleged incompetence when it comes to making important decisions about politics. But some states go further and they'll practice things like felon disenfranchisement. Non-citizen residents will not get a vote, so I can't vote in American elections. Some might say that's a good thing. Restricted suffrage, when people are talking about that, it's usually going beyond those initial restrictions. So to use the prime example, on some forms of epistocracy, people who don't pass qualification exams will not get voting rights, although we're going to talk about that later. Lastly, you get even broader questions about selection mechanisms. Now, by selection mechanisms here, I mean, how do we select people who are to lead in some sense? So you can use elections like we currently do. You can use something called sortition, which is allocating political power using lotteries, random lotteries, or whatever, pulling swords out of stones, who can win the most arm wrestles, whatever, something stupid like that. That could, in principle, be a selection mechanism, but typically it's elections. Many people nowadays advocate for sortition, and that also is going to come up later. So what do we mean by institutional design? Well, Institutional design sort of connotes the creation of institutions de novo, as if they were like political philosophers sitting in their armchair, stroking their beard, thinking very hard, and coming up with them out of nowhere. In practice, it's virtually always assessing, critiquing, amending, revising, or if they're totally defective, abandoning existing political institutions. So some people might say we should just abandon the practice of using elections to select political leaders because although they are useful in some respects, they're also problematic in even more respects. That's a little bit off topic, but that's just an example of a question in institutional design. So why do I think institutional design is important? So here's a slogan. Of course, this is not maximally detailed, but this encapsulates why I think this is worth thinking about. If you change the institutions, you change the incentives. And when you change the incentives, you change the political outcomes. So here are some more concrete examples, going off of some of the examples of political institutions I just mentioned. So when you combine plurality voting with what I call single member districts, what happens sometimes is that you get de facto two-party states. And it's typically just because setting up the voting system that way incentivizes certain forms of behavior wherein two main parties will come to dominate. So, for example, people when they're voting, they don't want to feel like they've wasted their vote. So they won't vote for like smaller marginal candidates who are not likely to win. They're going to go for the bigger candidates who they might think have a better chance of winning. So they're going to engage in strategic voting. And it also incentivizes factioning on the parts of political parties because political parties know that if they are small and unpopular, they have less of a chance of winning. So they'll form coalitions and so on. So this is a phenomenon called Duverger's law. I say law, it's in scare quotes there. I'm not sure if it's what most people would think of as a natural law, but a lot of people will say that it's an artifact of the United States political system, for example, that we have this de facto two-party system. It's why the Republicans and Democrats always dominate. And if you think that's a bad thing, then one good place to look at is changing the voting system, for example, by going to approval voting or some other alternative method of voting. Now, the second example here is more relevant to today's topic. Some people think that when you pair universal suffrage, that is, when you distribute fundamental political power equally and universally about the adult population, when the population is sufficiently large, you're going to get something called rational voter ignorance. The idea is that people realize the probability of the vote making a difference is so astronomically low, and the costs of being politically informed are really high. So people will rationally refrain from gathering too much political information. I actually don't think that's the best way to think about rational ignorance, but for now, I think the point is just that, again, it's an artifact of the political institutions we have that ignorance is incentivized, so to speak. And another one that's interesting, when you have elections with quite short term limits, when you pair them with short term limits for politicians, right, let's say every 4 years, you're going to, invariably get a short term focus. Politicians will be incentivized to have big, flashy, near term, visible outcomes that maximize their electoral success. But that's not necessarily good for long term benefits. So if you're an effective altruist interested in long termism, which many people are, one good place to look at, again, is our political institutions. By the way, if you're interested in that sort of thing and learning about it in more detail, you should check out the work of Tyler John. He's a fellow Rutgers graduate student. He's doing some very interesting work on this. So is this the sort of thing that effective altruists should focus on? Well, let's take the three classical criterion here, or the criteria. So you can think about it in terms of whether it's high impact, whether it's neglected, whether it's tractable. So it's high impact, in my opinion, given the sheer amount of power and resources that governments can bring to bear on, mitigating and solving widespread problems. It looks like it might be high impact if you can make political institutions function a bit better. But it's also very risky, right? Because if you do this thing incorrectly, you might make things even worse. So that's something I often worry about. Whether it's neglected, I think that's a bit easier to answer. I think it is still neglected. It's a bit less neglected than it used to be. So you're getting people in effective altruism thinking about alternative voting methods and so on, and long-termism and its relation to political institutions. But still, it would be nice if more people were thinking about this. Now, in academia, it's not neglected in a sense. So you get lots of political philosophers working on aspects of institutional design, and political economists and political scientists and so on. But in my experience, people don't really talk to one another all that well. So the people who are really interested in sortition aren't talking to the epistocrats, and they're not talking to the effective altruists, and they're not talking to the public choice theorists, and the public choice theorists won't have a clue about like global catastrophic risks or at least the strange sort of risks that EAs are typically interested in. So in that sense, it's still neglected. Taking a broad synoptic view of the field is still quite neglected. And lastly, is it tractable? Boring answer. It's going to depend on the proposed institutional reform. If all you're trying to do is amend the voting system, for example, that looks tractable. You know, indeed, some states in America already have changed from plurality voting to approval voting, I think. I'm not quite sure. If you're interested in abolishing elections altogether and replacing those with the use of lotteries to select political leaders, as interesting as I think that proposal is, it's probably a little bit less tractable. Anyway, so that's, I hope, I was a very short cursory introduction to what I mean by institutional design and that sort of thing. But I hope you sort of realize the sort of project that I'll be engaged in today. Now, the focus today is a little bit narrower than that. So we're going to think about epistocracy. So here's a quote from Jason Brennan. He's probably the most famous proponent of this view working nowadays, although he's not the only one. So you should check out his book Against Democracy. It's really good, very interesting. So here he says, a political system is epistocratic to the extent it distributes political power in proportion to knowledge or competence as a matter of law or policy. So again, there are legal requirements on access to some form of political power, and it's based on how much you know about politics or economics or social science or whatever is deemed politically relevant. There's a bunch of different ways you can cash out this very broad formula. So we're going to look at a few examples today. So you have restricted suffrage, which sounds exactly, you know, what it is. Basically, you are implementing, let's say, qualification requirements on voting privileges or something like that. Plural voting is related, though slightly different. Instead of restricting access to voting power, what you do is allocate greater votes to people who are more qualified in a certain sense. Then you've got these other options we'll talk about in more detail, the veto council, the epistocratic council, something called enlightened preference simulation. This is an interesting one. And lastly, this one called the enfranchisement lottery. I have this with an asterisk there. In my opinion, this is not a pure epistocratic system. So I'm going to talk about this towards the end of the talk if I have time. So in more detail, right? So restricted suffrage, I've already kind of mentioned here. You would implement widespread qualification exams. Now, Brennan in his book says that these exams should be minimally demanding. I take it this is just a strategic decision to make the exams more appealing to a wider cross-section of society. You don't want to get yourself embedded in too many controversial discussions about what the content of the exams would be. So there's going to be only very basic things that everybody can agree upon, like how many branches of government are there and so on and so forth. What powers do they have? And of course, you only get voting privileges if you pass these exams. It's worth mentioning that restricted suffrage is Jason Brennan's least favorite form of this. It's not very plausible. And a lot of people make the mistake of identifying epistocracy with restricted suffrage, and that's it. But that's not true. There's different forms. Plural voting is related. So again, you can use exams to identify people who are appropriately qualified, or you can use like suitable proxies like education levels. And the idea is that you allocate greater numbers of votes to people who are more qualified. So if you're a philosophy PhD student, you should be getting 50 votes. No, I'm just kidding, all right? But you get the idea. With the veto council, here's the idea. You now implement like an independent epistocratic council. And instead of having minimally demanding qualification requirements, you have like extremely demanding qualification requirements. So this council would, in principle, only be staffed with people who know quite a lot about political science, economics, political philosophy even. You're only going to have veto powers in this council, right? So there's no positive legislative powers. They can just veto legislation that they deem to be incompetently made for whatever reason. This is an interesting one, enlightened preference epistocracy. Brennan calls this rule by simulated oracle. So the idea is that you'll have mandatory exams that test political knowledge. And at the same time, you'll gather demographic information about the people taking these exams. And at the same time, gather information about their political preferences. And then utilizing various methods, you can simulate the preferences of people according to what demographic group they happen to be in, relative to, simulate their preferences with full knowledge, relative to the content of the exams, of course. So the idea is that we would base policy on what a hypothetical, like epistemically idealized population would want. And for what it's worth, that's Brennan's favorite proposal of epistocracy, or at least it was at some point. Perhaps his views have changed. So that's what that's what epistocracy is. And those are a few examples. There are probably others. So you might be thinking, sure, that's what it is. Why the hell should I want to do something like that? Here's a very simple model of democratic institutional failure that you will find people talking about in the literature. It's got two components, right? On the one hand, you're going to have ignorant voters, and on the other, you're going to have responsive political leaders, or people who will be willing to pander to the electorate. So you might be thinking, are voters really all that ignorant? And unfortunately, the answer is yes. This is an extremely well-documented phenomenon. People have been studying this since the 50s or 60s, I think. So if you look at the literature in public polling or in political psychology, it's clear that voters are ignorant of even very basic political issues. I don't mean like they're ignorant of what the most recent obscure bit of legislation coming from like the EPA or something is or whatever. It's more like they don't know, or they often don't know, how many branches of government there are, who the representatives are, who's making what decisions and why, who to punish for what, and who to blame for what, and who should be praised for certain things. So I say with my tongue in cheek, just talk to voters for a little while. But again, if you just peruse social media and look at the quality of political discussion, you will see voter ignorance in action. So the important point here is that this ignorance is rational. So some comments here. By rational, this is not like a positive evaluation of the ignorance, right? So when people in political economy are talking about rationality, they mean instrumental rationality. It's about selecting the appropriate means to one's chosen ends. So again, I mentioned this earlier, the idea is that, well, for most people talking about rational ignorance, the idea is that given the extremely low probability that they'll affect the election, and given the very high cost of acquiring sufficient information to be well informed, most voters will choose not to become informed. I don't think that's the best way to think about it. I think you should just think about it in terms of the opportunity cost of becoming well informed. I don't think voters are going around necessarily thinking about probabilities of outcomes and so on. It's just that it's really hard and time consuming to become well informed. And just to, again, ward off any sort of accusations of elitism or anything here, ignorance isn't necessarily stupidity, right? So you're going to get some voters who are rationally ignorant, who are quite brilliant people. They just don't give a damn about learning about politics, right? It's not a valuable use of their time to them. Sure, some voters are stupid, but many are brilliant, far more brilliant than I am, and they are still rationally ignorant. Now, when you think about things in terms of rationality in this sense, it becomes obvious that you can get things like rational ignorance, rational epistemic irrationality. So again, it can be rational in a sense for people to discount information, to not ward off their various cognitive biases and so on. You get rational lying, rational bullshitting. In philosophy of language, people distinguish these two. When you're lying, you're saying something you believe to be false in order to mislead another. When you're bullshitting, you just don't care about whether what you say is true or false or not. And those behaviors can all be rational. But when it comes to epistocracy, the important point is that voters are ignorant, and it's at least allegedly rational. I don't think you need the rationality to get the argument to work, but that's the idea. So are political leaders responsive? Well, the idea here again is that with the system we have, responsiveness to voters is incentivized. Your electoral success as a candidate is tied to your willingness to pander to your base. Now, it's easy to push this point too far. Responsiveness is absolutely not full whatsoever. So political representatives have a certain degree of autonomy. The most recent political science and political psychology indicates that voters form their preferences on like ideological grounds or identity-based grounds. It's not like they have fully formed policy preferences and it's in virtue of their preferences that representatives form policy or anything like that. But I assume that voters do exert some influence, and that's certainly true. And of course, the epistocrat is going to say when voters exert influence, whether it's limited or not, and when voters are rationally ignorant, you're going to get bad outcomes, or at least suboptimal outcomes. So given that model, you might be thinking, why do I talk about demand side politics in the subtitle? Because the model has both a demand side and a supply side, right? The demand side is voters demanding certain sorts of laws and policies. The supply side is, of course, people who are willing to give those laws and policies to the voters. The reason I talk about demand side is because That's really the core of this model of democratic deficiency. Epistocrats will place voters and their irrational ignorance at the core of what makes democracies sometimes go badly. I say sometimes, right, because again, this is another common misconception about epistocrats. There's a worry that epistocrats are just woefully ignorant about existing literature and democratic theory, suggesting that democracies do very well along certain dimensions. And that's not true. Nobody really denies that democracies do various things very well. The worry is just that they have some very obvious sources of institutional failure, and that, you know, they're worth mitigating if at all possible. Okay, so how would epistocracy mitigate this problem of political ignorance among voters? So this is going to be a little bit quick, but there's the three options I'm going to focus on today. When you have restricted suffrage, the idea is that you're screening for the most ignorant voters, right? People who can't answer the questions on the exams will no longer have voting privileges, and so they're no longer going to be able to, you know, make poor decisions about who the best candidates are. And there's no longer going to be incentives for political leaders to pander to voters who will be misinformed about like basic economics, basic social science, or whatnot. With the veto council, the idea is that this very competent council will be able to veto legislation that it deems to be incompetent for whatever reason. And again, there are further downstream incentives. So if you're a lawmaker and you're thinking about the prospect of gridlock from this council that's going to veto really bad policy that keeps coming its way, you might think, well, we should probably get it right the first time and make sure we're making the policy in as competent a fashion as we can. Lastly, with enlightened preference epistocracy, the idea is that representatives will be incentivized to respond to the preferences of these like hypothetical idealized voters, right? So again, relative to the content of these exams, policy decisions will be made based on the people who know the most. Of course, there's a bunch of controversial questions about what the content of these exams will be. Perhaps that's the sort of thing we can talk about in the Q&A. But I'll just leave it there for now, while acknowledging that that's a serious issue. So again, this is going very quickly. You put all that together. Here's like an argument for epistocracy that you might find. So you take the claim that epistocracies will mitigate voter ignorance, whether it's restricted suffrage or veto council or whatnot. And the idea is that epistocracy will produce better outcomes than democracy. What do we mean by better outcomes? I'm going to be a little bit of a weasel here, and I'm not going to define this. The idea is just that minimally, talk of better outcomes will have to presuppose some sort of procedure independent outcome. So the idea is that we're not tying the procedure by which outcomes are delivered into our definition of whether they are better or worse. That sounds like a bit of a mouthful, but some people will want to say that good policy is democratically made policy. And I'm basically assuming that that's a no-go, although that's, I mean, outside of the scope of my paper, that's a live issue that we can talk about, again, in the Q&A. So the idea is that epistocracy will produce better outcomes than democracy. Second premise, we should implement whatever political arrangement produces the best outcomes. This, in effect, is sort of like a tacit assumption of pure instrumentalism. Again, when we're interested in political arrangements, we're interested in whether they bring about good consequences. We're not interested in their procedural virtues or whatnot. The third premise, if the first two premises are true, then we should implement epistocracy. That's quite straightforward. And then the straightforward entailment to the conclusion. So here's a bunch of counter arguments, right? Because that's all extremely controversial. Make no mistake about it. So it's not like what I'm saying there is taken for granted. You can reject the first premise, right? So in democratic theory right now, there's this kind of subfield called epistemic democracy. And epistemic Democrats think that, you know, the focus on individual voter ignorance is something of a red herring. Because by various means in democracies, you can get collective intelligence emerging from individual ignorance. And they appeal to various mathematical theorems to make their point more plausible, like Condorcet's jury theorem and the Hong-Page theorem. If you don't know what they are and you want to talk about them, again, ask in the Q&A, because this is one of the more contentious bits of the epistocratic argument. Again, the upshot is that it doesn't matter if each individual voter is ignorant. The collective can make collectively intelligent decisions. Another different way to reject premise one, and I actually take this one a bit more seriously, is that you just might think there will be serious abuse of epistocratic institutions. So, you know, ideally, if you could get everything to work and you apportion political power to those who are most competent, and everyone's acting in good faith and no one is engaging in like power grabbing or anything like that, then yeah, sure, maybe it would work. But in the real world, people will have incentives to abuse the system and maybe exclude their political opponents or exclude people they just don't like for whatever reason. A lot of people worry about how similar some epistocratic institutions are to previous practices of excluding people of certain ethnicities and so on from voting rights. And that's all very bad. And I take that worry far more seriously than the stuff about epistemic democracy. Again, I'm happy to talk about why. But for the purposes of this talk, I'm going to bracket those issues, right? Same with premise 2. You can reject premise 2. So as I mentioned or alluded to, you can be what's called a pure proceduralist. So you might think what makes policy good or what makes laws good is not their substantively just outcomes or their procedure independent effects. It's how they're made. So you might think there's just something intrinsically just about democratic procedures. Maybe they're like inherently fair. They're an inherently fair way of reaching agreement in a population characterized in part by deep normative disagreements. And of course, since I'm talking to a Brown audience from Brown University, I should mention epistemic proceduralism, which is the view of David Estlund, who's a very good, interesting political philosopher there you have. The idea is that he combines both proceduralism and the epistemic virtues of democracy, eliding some complicated detail. The idea is that democracy performs best epistemically out of a set of procedurally acceptable political arrangements. So you could accept some of those views and you would thereby reject premise 2. I think these views are not all that plausible sometimes, but again, I will defer questions about that until the end of the talk, and I'm happy to talk about it a bit more. Here's my argument. It's very easy. Premise 3 is probably false, right? You might have noticed epistocracy focuses quite disproportionately on voters and their ignorance. But it's not like voters and their ignorance are the only source of bad government, right? Or there's plenty of things that can go wrong. So what I do in my paper is that I just assume that all those extant critiques of epistocracy fail. I just grant a bunch of generous assumptions to the epistocrat. And I argue that it's still plausible that epistocracy shouldn't be the one we implement, because again, if you look at premise 3 here, all it says is that if epistocracy would produce better outcomes than democracy, and if we should implement whatever produces the best outcomes, we should implement epistocracy. The reason that's false is because, well, the logical space of possible institutional design is far broader than just epistocracy or democracy. And the amount of sources of bad governance are far broader than just voter ignorance. And you could have some alternative arrangements that tackle some of these different sources of bad governance. And they might do better than either epistocracy or standard democracy, or whatever other alternative you can think of. So what are some of these sources of bad governance that epistocrats miss out on, in my opinion? So here's just 2. There are probably more, but here are 2 important ones. The first is something I call incompetent leadership. And the second is what I'm calling political corruption. So what do we mean by incompetent leadership? Well, leadership first. By leader, I'm just stipulating anyone who's in a position to directly affect the legislative or policy-making process. So this is like standard people in the Senate or Congress or whatever, congressional staffers, bureaucrats, people working in administrative agencies and so on. They're all leaders in this sense. And incompetent is slightly misleading. It's better maybe to think of suboptimal, because while some of these people will do their job in like uncontroversially incompetent ways, some of them will be quite competent in discharging their duties. The idea is just that there are various failures that they may manifest in their decision making, and that these have negative effects on political outcomes, and they're worth mitigating. But epistocracy doesn't mitigate them. Sorry about that. So here's one thing you might be thinking, right? So you can think of like very visible examples of politicians endorsing all sorts of strange views. So you get lots of like climate change denialism among politicians. So you got to be careful with these anecdotes. Some of these alleged instances of incompetent leadership might be better explained as just sheer mendacity on the part of the politicians, right? They're just pandering. They may not be like sincerely such that they are actually skeptical about anthropogenic climate change or something like that. Again, I'm not a climate scientist, so I'm probably not going to get into the climate science question here. If you don't like that example, just plug in whatever example you like. Again, the idea is just that political leaders might know what the best sort of policy to implement is, and they just refuse to do it because of the incentives there. They have to pander if they want to stay in office. That's obviously not such a worry for people who work in, you know, bureaucracies and that sort of thing, but it's a worry for political representatives. Importantly, right, that's the sort of incompetence or mendacity, really, that epistocracy is actually well set up to manage. So that's not a good argument against epistocracy. So we need evidence of incompetent leadership that pulls apart from mere pandering or mere responsiveness to voters. So there's just some suggestive evidence here. I don't take this to be conclusive, but it's something worth thinking about. So a lot of you might be familiar with Philip Tetlock's research on expert political judgment. The upshot here is just that for various reasons, like, experts end up being like quite imperfect and sometimes quite bad at making predictions. They're often outperformed by even very basic heuristics and algorithms that they could have known about. A bit more robust, there's a bunch of recent literature on political psychology, and it just shows that political leaders often suffer from various biases, and sometimes at greater rates than the general public, right? So a few examples here, like the status quo bias. So even if the status quo is, all things considered, quite harmful, they might be biased to like stick by it. They'll escalate their commitment to failed policies because of some cost, even if they should abandon ship, and so on and so forth. And then lastly, and obviously, you just get general failures of reasoning that we find in absolutely everybody. Political leaders and so forth, they're not different from you and I. They're going to exhibit the same sorts of failures of reasoning. So here are some notes, and we've got to be careful here. None of this means that non-experts are better than experts. So a bunch of people tend to misinterpret the import of Tetlock's research. So like, it's important to recognize that research shows that like experts are sometimes imperfect at making predictions about like quite difficult subject matter. They're not being asked questions about like the uncontroversial stuff in their field about which there is a consensus. And experts do indeed outperform non-experts. The idea is just that they're fallible and that their decision-making could be improved. My argument certainly isn't experts are really bad, therefore democracy is better than epistocracy. That wouldn't really follow. It could just be that democracy is terrible, epistocracy would be terrible, everything would be terrible. That sounds like an argument for throwing up your hands and getting really depressed. So the mere fact that experts are terrible doesn't have that implication that democratic theorists want it to have. Even given all of this data, right, epistocracy might still be worth implementing over democracy. So what are the upshots? Well, everything is what it is and is no other thing, as they say. All I'm saying here is that political leaders discharge their duties in sometimes very incompetent ways and imperfect ways. And especially given the independence of many political leaders, so think about people in administrative agencies and bureaucracies, it seems like it's worthwhile improving how they make their decisions in general. So if they're using, let's say, generally reliable but still imperfect methods, it might be important to tackle their fallibility. And another important point here is that the vast bulk of policymaking and lawmaking takes place like out of the public eye in these administrative agencies and bureaucracies. So it could be that like, even if everybody who staffs these agencies is generally quite competent, it could be that even slight improvements to their general competence will yield very big benefits, right? More so than, for example, implementing minimally demanding epistocratic qualification exams as they do in restricted suffrage, right? Also worth mentioning here, there are indirect epistocratic effects. I sort of already alluded to this. When you implement an epistocracy, or if you were to implement an epistocracy, you would change the incentives. So politicians and leaders would now have incentives to pander to, at least in principle, less collectively incompetent bodies of voters and citizens and so on. So there would be like this indirect effect on the competence of people in power. But it probably wouldn't be enough, and it seems like direct measures are preferable. So we should tackle the problem head on rather than just hoping that there will be some indirect effects that are unintended. All right, so the second problem I mentioned is political corruption. So maybe this will offend some people. The literature on corruption is a little bit of a terminological mess. It's not well defined. So here are some examples. I'm pointing at my screen as if you can see what I'm doing here. So here are some examples of some of the terminology you can find in the literature. So you get clientelism and patrimonialism. basically this is about people like allocating different like benefits to people in the public in exchange for electoral support. So you might think about things like giving out subsidies in exchange for more votes or the support of a union or something like that, or imposing licensing restrictions so that people's competitors on the market will be harmed. And again, it's in exchange for political support. You get things like nepotistic hiring practices and favoritism and patronage and just good old-fashioned bribery and extortion. So it's a bit of a mess. A lot of these terms are not well defined, and a lot of them sound they actually point to phenomena that are very similar. For example, clientelism and patrimonialism. For concreteness, I'm going to focus on something I call regulatory capture. So you might be wondering what regulatory capture is. Here's the definition that's most common in the literature. I'll just read off the handout here. It's when political leaders use their power to further the interests of interest groups, special interest groups, rather than the general public. So an example might be passing legislation that prevents Uber from operating in a certain area. And the reason it is passed is because like a taxi union or something has the ear of the relevant legislative body. And it could be that this actually gives very concentrated benefits to people who work for taxi companies and so on, but it disperses even greater costs among the general public. Again, you might not like that example. That's just a general idea. Another example might be like climate change skeptics capturing environmental policy such that they benefit financially, but the public is harmed, or the long-term future health of the general public is harmed, something like that. So the idea here is that like interest groups are incentivized to organize and capture the legislative process because they can reap these very concentrated benefits. Meanwhile, voters, right, the costs are dispersed among a wide number of voters, so they're not incentivized to organize and combat this capture in the same way that interest groups are incentivized to get out there and try to capture the process. Because it could be that like to voters, to each individual voter, the cost is like an additional $50 a year or something. And, you know, $50 is $50, but they might not even notice it. Whereas to the interest groups, they're getting these very concentrated benefits to a small number of people. I should flag actually this definition of capture. It's imperfect for a reason I'll talk about in a few minutes, just in case you're wondering what the deal is there. So here are two mechanisms by which capture occurs. The first is something I call direct collusion. So the idea here is very simple. It's just that you can actually get intimate quid pro quo. Sorry, I'm stumbling on my words there. Intimate quid pro quo, long-standing relationships between people in interest groups and regulatory bodies tasked with regulating that industry. There might be a certain amount of like exchange of personnel between these two bodies. So you could get people who are part of a private industry who go into the legislative body and kind of give benefits to their buddies, and they know that they might actually go back into that private industry, and so they're kind of incentivized to pass legislation that's favorable for, again, the private industry from which they came. Then you get this other subtler form of capture, which doesn't really rely upon direct collusion between regulatory bodies and regulated industries. So I call this regulatory exploitation, and it's exploitation of existing information asymmetries. So here's what I mean by that. When a regulatory body is tasked with regulating a certain domain, they need to have access to specialized knowledge about that domain. So you might think about like environmental policy or agribusiness or something like that. And unfortunately, very many of the people with the requisite knowledge who they need to turn to for epistemic reasons end up being part of these private industries. So you have less than expert regulators going to members of a private industry with the requisite expertise. And exploiting the gap in knowledge between the two parties, the people who are part of the private industry may just like try to influence people to implement policy that will benefit them, even if it sort of disperses these wide costs on everybody else. For example, they might avail of what's called a benign policy image, where they sort of gussy up the policy and make it sound like it's going to be very good, but in fact, it's designed to give them direct benefits, right? So that's the rough idea. Two mechanisms of capture: collusion and exploitation. So here's some notes, right? Capture is hard to identify. It's hard to tell whether someone is genuinely attempting to capture a policy in this sort of like deliberate, nefarious way, or whether they just sincerely thought that the policy that they were proposing was actually good for the general public. So it could be that they were actually mistaken in good faith. That's just a general epistemic problem. It's hard to read people's motivations. Here's the second bullet point here. This is the reason I don't like the definition of capture given earlier. By that definition, capture isn't necessarily bad when considered impartially. It's like necessarily bad when it's considered procedurally. It's like a subversion of the way laws and policies are meant to be made. But when you consider things from, like, for example, without endorsing any sort of views in population ethics or normative ethics or anything like that, if you were to think about it in terms of like a long-termist utilitarian perspective, capture might be better than not, right? So if you were to get like a bunch of EAs interested in X risks, capturing relevant policy and, you know, they end up mitigating whatever downstream risk or something, that would be good from the perspective of a long-termist. I just assume that when capture occurs, it very often causes more harm than good. And you can find examples in the literature where this has occurred, right? Again, to be fair to the proponents of epistocracy, a lot of people will ignore this sort of thing. There are actually indirect effects of implementing an epistocracy. So even though people who propose epistocratic reforms are solely interested in voter ignorance and its effects, you get these downstream effects against capture. So it's related to something called informed monitoring. Now, the people at Brown who may have read the recommended reading for this talk, you will have read Alex Guerrero's very long, very good paper in Philosophy and Public Affairs called Against Elections, right? So it's in favor of this thing called autocracy. And he talks about this notion of informed monitoring. So when you want voters to hold representatives accountable, they need to be able to monitor their activities in an informed way. But unfortunately, due to rational ignorance, you don't get such informed monitoring. Now, in an epistocracy, you ideally, at least if it works correctly, you get a significantly more knowledgeable, competent voting base, and they may be able to engage in better practices of informed monitoring. I say may because you're going to get very mixed results here. So here's how I think about it. Restricted suffrage here is going to have low benefits. Why? Well, for procedural reasons, remember, you're going to have minimally demanding qualification exams. So it's just going to screen out for like the least competent, like bottom 5% of citizens or something like that. It's not going to give huge benefits, right? Most people still won't know most things about how policy is made. So it's unclear if you're going to be able to combat capture all that much. The veto council, it's unclear, right? Because we're not really given any concrete details about how many people, what tasks they'll be allocated to beyond vetoing incompetently made legislation. One thing I worry about is that such a council might itself be susceptible to capture depending on how it's staffed, right? So you might think if the experts are coming from these industries, which we're already worrying about, viz. Their ability and willingness to engage in capture, you might then think that the council itself will be captured. So that might be an imperfect way to combat this problem. And lastly, enlightened preference. This is an interesting result, right? Because a lot of people will champion enlightened preference as a method for combating voter ignorance, but it looks like it's going to have no or very low benefits when it comes to capture. Because when you think about it, it sort of leaves policymaking out of the hands of virtually every voter. It will tie policy outcomes to the preferences of these like totally hypothetical, maximally informed citizens, right? If you place yourself in the position of a voter under a scheme like that, you might think, well, I'm never going to be maximally well informed. My preferences are going to be discounted entirely. So why do I give a damn? It's not clear why people would be incentivized to monitor their political leaders to see whether they're being captured and so on. So again, I think here it's clear that direct measures, if possible, to mitigate capture are preferable to just hoping we get these downstream indirect effects from implementing epistocracy. So there's the upshot, right? We need institutional mechanisms for tackling these things, incompetent leadership and corruption, or capture more specifically. So there's at least two options here, at least how I think about it. You could implement relevant institutional reforms alone. So you could think about ways to mitigate incompetent leadership and just embed them in current democracy. Or you could go for what's called a hybrid political arrangement. So you could just take a bunch of different institutional reforms, think about whether they will work together. Some will be tackling voter ignorance, some will tackle capture and corruption, and so on and so forth. You can combine them all into a far more comprehensive package. At least that's the idea. So how can we tackle incompetent political leadership? One very, very obvious way, and this is something that's already being done, thankfully, just do more research on improved decision making. So it could be that the best decision making methods for political leaders are just what Phil Tetlock's project on super forecasting recommends. I'm sure there are some people in the audience who actually know more about the actual psychology than I do, because that's not really my area of specialty. But again, the idea is just that go out and investigate empirically what sorts of flaws political leaders exhibit in their day-to-day decision making, and think about ways in which we can improve the decision making, and that will yield direct benefits. And that, of course, is something that actually looks like it could be quite tractable. It's going to be something attractive to a wide array of people. It's not very partisan. Well, one would hope. Things tend to have a habit of becoming partisan. And you don't need to engage in very widespread institutional reform. This isn't like abolishing elections or anything like that. Another thing you could do is impose rigorous selection mechanisms for political leaders. So you get countries, actual countries now, doing things like this. So if you think about Singapore, they have what I call direct meritocratic constraints on access to political power. So the idea is that you have very demanding qualification requirements to be part of the Singaporean government. And they have these very active, rigorous recruitment practices where they'll identify young talent in schools, for example, and they'll take the top 1% of students, and they'll take that top 1% of students and take the top 1% of that, and they'll try to push them into political careers by incentivizing them with high pay and so on. And the end result is that you get very, very competent, smart people who are Singaporean politicians, basically. Another country that does this is China. Of course, I'm not pointing to China as an exemplar of good governance or anything, but again, the general idea is to just look at actual examples of implementing direct meritocratic constraints to, again, ideally, improve the overall competence of people who are inhabiting positions of leadership. So here's a bunch of worries you might have with all of that, and I'll take them in turn. The first is not substantive, it's like a terminological quibble in my opinion. Aren't meritocratic constraints just epistocratic? The second problem, what about the demand side? So we've been talking about voters and their ignorance. You might think you can impose all the meritocratic constraints you want. As long as you have voters and their demands, there are still going to be incentives to cater to those demands. It doesn't matter how competent the leaders are. The third worry is, what the hell about capture? Wasn't that just something we were talking about? So my response to one is this. Well, the answer is yes and no. Yes, direct meritocratic constraints count as epistocracy on a wide definition where it's just about restricting access to some form of political power by possessing competence or knowledge of some kind. But it's important to recognize that, that would be somewhat disingenuous as a response from proponents of epistocracy, in my opinion, because epistocracy in practice has almost exclusively focused on voters. The second, well, that was just a terminological quibble. The second more serious problem, again, that was what about the demand side? So here I think it's a good area to think about hybrid mechanisms. So you could pair, again, if you're willing to buy into this instrumentalism in the first place and ignore the possible procedural benefits of democracy, you could combine various demand side and supply side mechanisms, i.e. you could combine epistocratic institutions with meritocratic constraints, right? So you might combine Enlightened Preference epistocracy, which we've seen looks good in mitigating the voter side of things. You can combine them with meritocratic constraints. So you have very competent leaders responding to, again, maximally competent, maximally well-informed, hypothetical voters. The third worry is the most serious, obviously, right? You might think you can implement all the epistocracy and meritocracy you want. Well-qualified, smart leaders are not necessarily morally enlightened, and they may still engage in corrupt practices, especially if they're incentivized to do so. The first point, it's somewhat limited, but it's worth mentioning. Direct meritocratic constraints would have some, I think, anti-exploitation effects. Remember, by exploitation, I mean the exploitation of information asymmetries. Because again, when you think about it, you're going to have extremely smart, qualified people inhabiting political offices, right? So you might think if they have certain backgrounds, it will be hard to exploit existing information asymmetries because, by hypothesis at least, the information asymmetries won't be there, or they'll be reduced considerably. But that's just a limited point. Collusion is left unaddressed. This is speculative, but I worry collusion would actually be worse, because now what you have is a bunch of very smart, competent people who are better at hiding their corrupt behavior. So lastly, we should probably just think about pairing all of these mechanisms with mechanisms for combating capture. So how can we tackle capture? Now, I should be upfront here. It's not clear that there are very, very good comprehensive ways to tackle capture. A lot of things are unclear here, and all of these institutional proposals have their own problems. So one thing people talk about in the literature is just paying people a bit better. So one reason to do this is to attract top talent to political office or into political careers in the way that Singapore does, right? So again, you have these competent, qualified people, and instead of being attracted to jobs in the private industries or whatever, some of them may go into politics, just because they know that, or it's no longer the case that if they were to go into the private industry, they'd be paid so much more. So well compensate political leaders. That might do something. Does that mean they're going to collude a little bit less? Well, sometimes it looks like it does, but I suspect that just turns on existing anti-corruption norms being in the culture already. Other times, you're probably just going to get richer people who are willing to engage in corrupt practices. So you're going to be paying corrupt politicians a bit better. So that's not going to work. Some of the things that are probably going to be imperfect and won't work, you might just improve existing monitoring and enforcement of already existing anti-corruption laws. Obvious problem, in highly corrupt societies, the very people who are there and tasked with monitoring politicians for their corrupt behavior, they may themselves be corrupt. So that's not going to work either, or at least it's not going to work all of the time. And again, independent anti-corruption agencies, you get the same sort of worry arising. And when you look at the literature, there seems to be some success when these agencies have the support of high-ranking officials and citizens and so on. Again, somewhat speculatively, I think what's happening here is that the high-ranking officials have incentives to pander to citizens, right? So it's a sort of democratic mechanism, so to speak. But the worry is that citizens might, in a biased way, pick out corrupt politicians. So the worry might be that they will identify as corrupt politicians who they dislike, whereas the party they support will not be identified as corrupt, even if they are actually engaging in corrupt practices, as long as they're not being made to pay too high of a cost, or at least not being made to pay too high of a cost in a way that's visible to them. I realize that's very cynical, but I think that's a real worry. So there's probably a bunch of other reforms you could implement, and they would be intermediate between very simple, highly imperfect things like paying people better. And this option, we could call this the nuclear option. I kind of love this option because it's very clever and innovative in a way. So Alex Guerrero, who's a political philosopher at Rutgers, advocates something he calls lotocracy. So the idea with lotocracy is to allocate political power using sortition. So remember, sortition is just when you use lotteries to select people at random to inhabit political office. So you combine that sortition with what he calls single issue legislatures. So we'd be moving from generalized legislatures like we currently have to specialized single issue legislatures, like you might have one tasked with agriculture legislator, or healthcare, education, whatever. Questions about how coarse-grained or fine-grained to be, of course. And they'll have expert training. They'll have to engage in deliberation with one another. They'll have to engage in community outreach to see what the general public who are not sorted into single issue legislators think about things. And of course, they're going to have to engage in, what they're being paid to do, which is make laws and policies. So the idea when it comes to capture here is this, that when you have random selection, you actually prevent interest groups from kind of grooming candidates in advance or identifying them in advance to subsequently engage in capture, right? So think about it. So you don't know who's going to be selected for political office. So you can't pick out anyone in advance and say, oh, that person is someone we could potentially get to enter into a quid pro quo relationship with us. Another part of Alex's proposal is that you're going to have fixed rotating terms. And this, again, prevents the establishment of these like long-term iterated relationships between regulators and the industries they regulate. So here's a bunch of problems you might think about it, because this is a very drastic option. It's unclear if it would work in practice. the first worry people usually have is that there's going to be trade-offs between whatever anti-capture benefits you get from using sortition and the competence of those sorted into political office in the first place. Because remember, you're selecting only from ordinary random citizens, perhaps subject to like very minimal requirements like we currently have in a democracy, like you have to be over 18 or something like that. So one thing to think about here is that the training phase of a autocracy will hopefully improve competence. And there's actually some suggestive evidence from work on things like deliberative polls and citizens' assemblies, showing that ordinary citizens can become pretty competent once their task is suitably delimited, right? So they're not being given too high of a burden. And the single issue focus also would help with that. So again, you're not sorting random citizens into generalist legislatures. They're being given a small, narrow task. With, depending on who you talk to, it could be 299 other citizens or 499 other citizens. So there'll be 300 to 500 people on these bodies. Another thing is that they're going to be heavily incentivized to perform competently. I can't remember Alex's precise figure, but it was something like they'd be paid, I don't know, like $500,000 a year, which for most Americans constitutes a huge raise. Here's another worry though, and this is a worry I have. So there's a training phase. This is supposed to mitigate the lack of expertise of people selected to be part of these legislative bodies. Who are going to be the experts taking part in this training phase? If they're experts tied to industries, you're thereby going to reintroduce worries about information exploitation and how that leads to capture, right? Because again, you might think the citizens, when they are first sorted in, may not have the knowledge or expertise to know whether they're being subverted or whether the relevant experts are exploiting a benign policy image, telling them a bunch of misleading things so that they get policies passed that will benefit them in the long run. I think I skipped a slide there, hang on. No, I didn't, sorry. So here's a solution to that. I'm not sure how well this would work. Again, you need the lottery to be fair and not tampered with, which may not be the case. But if you choose experts at random from a previously defined body of experts that are like appropriately credentialed and qualified and so on, then it's not like you're going to have experts with ties to, you know, such and such a company or whatever. You're going to select at random. They don't know who's going to be involved. Whether that works or not, I'm not sure. Again, all of this is an empirical question. We're going to talk about that in the conclusion. And if you're still worried about the competence of people selected at random to be part of special single issue legislatures, again, go hybrid. If you are into that sort of thing, you could sort from a suitably delimited body of competent citizens. So again, you might impose qualification requirements, and only those people who pass qualification requirements are subject to being sorted. There's an example of an existing hybrid proposal in the literature. This is Lopez Guerra's enfranchisement lottery. I'm going to just mention it very quickly and then move on. The idea is that you select a bunch of citizens at random. They're your pre-voters. Only pre-voters will be eligible to vote in elections. To be able to actually vote in elections, they're going to have to pass some qualification exams. But although I think that has the right idea in terms of being a hybrid arrangement, I don't think it would work very well, because you might have noticed that it combines sortition with an electoral system, whereas the whole point of sortition for very many people was to use sortition to choose political leaders in the hopes that we would combat capture, right? And you might also recognize that it just neglects the problems we've been talking about, namely incompetent leadership and so on. So in general, the idea here is to go for hybrid arrangements that combine comprehensive measures that will tackle all sorts of sources of bad governance, whether it's voter ignorance, capture, incompetent leadership, or whatever you can think about, political short-termism and so on. So here's my conclusion, and I'm going to end with a confession and a plea. The confession is just that this has all been an exercise in informed speculation. I do say this in the paper as well. I'm probably not doing myself any favors there, because like we know a lot about voter ignorance and its sources, and we know a lot about capture and more or less how it occurs, and we know a bit about incompetent leadership, although it's much less studied than voter ignorance. But we don't really know whether these reforms would work in practice, and the only way we're going to be able to figure out whether they'll work is to actually try to implement them. But that raises strategic questions, right? First and foremost, how are you going to ever experiment with these sorts of reforms, right? It's not like we can do randomized controlled trials or something like that, or maybe you could, I don't know, but it's not like we're, I don't know, testing a new medication or something like that. These are vast, complex social entities involving like hundreds and thousands of people. It's unclear how we're going to be able to gather data that tests their relative efficacy. So we got to think about how we can actually experiment and gather more data about whether they'd work. And supposing some of them do work, we got to think about how we're going to go on and implement them. So you might remember at the start I mentioned tractability, and I said it's just going to depend on a case-by-case basis. Well, part of tractability is thinking about how we can implement the relevant institutional proposals. Maybe we'll have to go for like some sort of incrementalist strategy where we just, I don't know, if you're interested in sortation, for example, you might first allocate responsibility over a certain domain to a limited number of randomly selected citizens in like one very specific geographic area, and make it something that's like not altogether that important, or make it something that's like not partisan, so people don't care if it's, you know, pushed off to voters. But these are all open questions. I'm absolutely willing to listen to people who have ideas about this. I've only just started thinking about the strategic aspects of this sort of thing recently. So on that note, I will finish. So yeah, that's it. Thanks.
Thank you very much.